One of the themes that we did hear a lot about was interest in food, and a lot of times we talk about seafood from the catching side, and there was a lot of talk about what about local foods from the eating side. And so that leads to, we're really, really excited to welcome our keynote speaker. We were so pleased that his schedule allowed this window that he could come here to talk to us. He's got 2 books, For Fish and American Catch, and he, if you haven't read them, he writes in a way that's really easy to read, it's entertaining, and he does that thing that's really hard to do where you take science and policy and put it in a way that your grandmother in Des Moines could understand it. So anyway, without much further ado, Paul Greenberg.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here in Oregon. I have to say, if it weren't for Oregon, I probably wouldn't be here. I see a lot of young faces here, so when I was around your young people's age, I took a year off from college, and I went to count salmon and steelhead for the Bureau of Land Management through the Student Conservation Association. It was back in '87. Anybody here, by the way, remember a guy named Neil Armentrout? Raise any hands if you, oh, good. Anyway, so I worked for Neil, and it was quite an experience. And during that time, I realized that I should absolutely not be allowed to be a fisheries biologist. I crashed the truck. I dropped the department's only camera in the water. And then in addition to all that, I was doing a habitat inventory of a place called Fish Creek in the Coast Range, and there had been some habitat improvements that were supposedly designed to make the river longer, with more meander so that there'd be woody cover and more salmon habitat. And after I measured it, I made the river shorter. So I realized that I had to get myself out of science as quickly as possible. So I did, but nonetheless, fishing in the natural world are really where my heart lies. Raise your hand if you're a fisherman of any kind. All right, pretty fishy crowd. Raise your hand if you eat fish more than once a week. Whoa, this is an extremely fishy crowd. Excellent. You'll keep me on my toes. Raise your hand if you're a fisheries biologist, by the way. Very scary. Okay. Everything I say has qualifications to it. So anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about this. I wanted today to talk a little bit about this book, but also to talk about, in general, how we eat from the sea today as Americans and how we might kind of reconsider how that happens. So previous to writing American Catch, I wrote a book called For Fish, and when you're a nonfiction writer, when you're going beyond a magazine, you're always looking for kind of a spine of your book. By the way, who would like to write a book at some point in their lives? Don't do it. Anyway, no, do it. Just remember the repercussions. So anyway, when you want to go beyond a magazine article, you look for a spine. And with For Fish, the spine that I found was that 100 years ago, pretty much everything we ate from the sea was wild. Now we're at the point where about half of it is farmed. So epical shift. So that was the spine of that book. This book, though, came about kind of more, in a way, organically, emotionally, and it came about actually. So I was living in New York City. I was living sort of happy bachelor life in a little apartment in Greenwich Village, and I fish a lot, and I would go on these long fishing trips. Sometimes I'd go offshore to fish for tuna, and then I would carve up the carcass in my bathtub. It was like a scene out of The Godfather. I literally slept with the fishes, that was kind of my life. It was fun. It was a little lonely, but that's what it was. But then, of course, certain point, a guy, falls in love, and which is both good and a mistake. And in my sense, when you fall in love in New York, you fall in love with both the person and also with the real estate, because real estate in New York is a very valuable commodity, and you have to figure out, you triangulate. So my partner Esther lived all the way downtown, and when I say all the way downtown, I thought I lived really far downtown, but she lived all the way downtown at the very, very tip of the island of Manhattan. So I moved in pretty quickly, and I was very happy with my home life. But the more I sort of wandered around this neighborhood, the more kind of, alienated I felt. It was the financial district. It was all glass and banks and brokerage houses. And if you're a freelance writer, banks and brokerage houses have a way of kind of turning your day sour. You don't really have an opportunity to visit with them on a business kind of way. So anyway, that was my life, and I was wandering around, and I was feeling kind of alienated, until one morning, I got up very early, and as Flexen can attest, I get up extremely early, and we were discussing insomnia last night. So I was up at 4 in the morning, and I decided I would just get on my bike and try and figure out if there was anything in this neighborhood that could draw me in. And I live right near Ground Zero, so I got on my bike, I kind of circled around the big hole in the ground, and then I decided to kind of figure out, well, where's the river here? So I got on my bike and I got onto a road immediately called Maiden Lane. And I was later to learn that Maiden Lane was in Dutch times called de Magdeplatje, the Maiden's Path. It was an ancient road, and it dated back to the time when my neighborhood, the financial district, was called New Amsterdam, when it was the original fishing port of America, the original seaport of America. So I headed down to Magdeplatje, and I went against traffic, though there was very little at that hour, and I came across another street, and it was called Pearl Street. Once upon a time, der Pearlstraat, named because once upon a time it was one of the first paved roads in America, and it was paved with native oyster shell pulled out of the East River, harvested right there. So I went past along the Pearlstraat, I kept going, and then at a certain point I noticed that the banks and the brokerage houses started to give up, and that there was a different kind of architecture, old Greek Revival buildings. And when I looked at all these Greek Revival buildings, I saw that on the buildings was sort of a vague, hazy stenciling of businesses that had come and gone. Joseph LaRocca Shellfishing Company, Slavin and Sons, seafood, and more of these sort of vestiges of this other place. So I kept going, and I kept going, and I kept going. I came onto an old plaza in disarray called Peck Slip, and I went further and further, and I eventually got to South Street, and I got to this, the Fulton Fish Market. It was 2005. The Fulton Fish Market was then alive and well. It was a mess. It smelled horrible. There was all sorts of yells and shouts and whistles and hand gestures, and apparently the mafia charged you several $100s to move your fish from one corner of a block to another, but I loved it. And I was immediately taken with the place, and I thought, wow, this is really great. You know, my sterile financial district has a bit of New Amsterdam still left. It still breathes and lives and feels like the sea. So I decided I would kind of make the Fulton Fish Market a regular part of my life. And one day, after visiting a few more times, I decided I would make a big circumnavigation by bicycle of the island of Manhattan. So I headed up the west side, past piers and all sorts of marine infrastructure that's still there, largely because of striped bass. All along the west side, there is now a beautiful waterfront park. But in the 70s, there was a plan called Westway to put in a 6-lane highway that would have paved over all those old piers. That project was effectively stopped because of the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency did one of the first environmental impact statements and found spawning striped bass in those piers. So I kept going all the way north, finally to Inwood Park, and rounded and saw the last little corner of salt marsh that remains in Manhattan. Manhattan, as those who study the Northeast ecosystems know, the Hudson-Raritan estuary, around which Manhattan sits, is one of the most productive, should be one of the most productive estuaries in North America, if not in the world. But today it only has a small fragment of the salt marsh it once had. It used to have thousands of acres of salt marsh. There was just this one little swatch left at Inwood Park. So I went down further and further, kept going, and I finally reached what I think of as the triple necklaces of Manhattan, the Williamsburg, the Manhattan, and the Brooklyn Bridge, and I passed underneath those. And I was really excited to end my circumnavigation with the Fulton Fish Market, but this is what I found. Fulton Fish Market was gone. 2005, the city fathers finally decided enough was enough. They'd been fighting to get rid of the Fulton Fish Market for years, and finally they banished it to a far northern outpost of the Bronx. I was talking to one of the fishmongers up there in the new Fulton Fish Market, and I should say, the old Fulton Fish Market was really at human scale, and you dealt with people in a very kind of hand-gestury kind of way, and you could buy a pallet of salmon, or you could buy a single flounder. It was that kind of place. But the new Fulton Fish Market is this sort of towering, sterile white building, very cold. And these huge Italian guys who used to run the old Fulton Market, they're still there up in the Bronx, but they look about this big in this airplane hangar. And I said to one of the mongers, I said, how do you feel about being up here, up here in the Bronx with your market here? And he said, you know where they put us? Right here. So that to me kind of got me thinking like that this was actually something that was going on not just with the Fulton Fish Market, but with fisheries and seafood in general in this country. And that's when I came across this kind of other interesting statistic, which is the United States controls more ocean than any country on Earth. 2.8 billion acres of ocean, much more than we have set aside for producing land food. But more than 80% of our seafood comes to us from abroad. Sometimes it's been as high as 91%. It goes up and down. It's hard to track these statistics, but quite a bit. And I remember I was up in the New Fulton Fish Market, and I tracked down Herb Slavin of Slavin & Sons. And I'd always heard all these sort of myths about him, that he was this sort of elegant figure that would lie on a fainting couch while people would present him pallets of fluke and say, oh, Mr. Slavin, could you possibly buy my 300 pounds of summer flounder? Oh, I don't know if I need any summer flounder. So it was like he was apparently this great figure, and I was kind of intimidated to meet him. But I went to his stall, and I said, can I talk to Herb Slavin? And Herb Slavin came out. This was like a little Jewish guy. Came out and said, hello, I'm Herb. Nice to meet you. And I said, Herb, what do you think about the fact that more than 80% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad? And without missing a beat, he goes, who's the broad? and I was like, whoa. And it was like, that was so quick, and that was the way fishermen are, and that's the way fishmongers are, just quick, fast. Sole coming in from the east, last coming in from the west, it's just boom, 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 boom. And he's like, yeah, who's the broad? Who's the lady? With all the fish, who's that lady? And so he was both joking and not joking. I mean, if there had been that lady, he would have wanted to meet her. So, and I got to thinking, that this was actually an interesting thing, and this was my spine. This was what I wanted to talk about. This was the book that I wanted to do. So that's what I decided to do. So to discuss this, the good question, who's the broad? What is this seafood? Why is all the seafood coming to us from abroad? Well, let's take a look. So number one most consumed seafood in America is shrimp. 90% of our shrimp is coming to us from abroad, and half of it is farmed, and a lot of it is coming to us from Southeast Asia. And if any of you read the recent report in the U.K. Guardian, you will know that a certain portion of the labor that's used to harvest all the little fish that are ground up to feed the shrimp on those farms are slaves. That slave labor seems to be a rampant part of the Thai shrimp industry. So that's 90% of our seafood is this very dubious product coming to us from all sorts of places, a lot of which we can't even track. Number two most consumed seafood in America is canned tuna. Tuna came to us largely because of our own volition. Actually, it was Douglas MacArthur, when he was provisional governor of Japan after the war, realized he needed to do something to get the Japanese back on their feet. One of the things he encouraged was whaling. Another thing he encouraged was the development of an offshore fleet. And once that offshore fleet started going to all kinds of waters, they looked for tuna. And that's when you saw this really huge surge in tuna production. Number three most consumed fish in America is salmon. And you would think salmon should be this American staple. I mean, here we are in the salmon nation. We have a lot of salmon. We know that Alaska produces more than 200 million pounds of salmon per year. But it's crazy what goes on with our salmon. Something like 80% of our salmon, our wild salmon, is exported. Meanwhile, the salmon that we actually eat, 2/3 of it is farmed and coming to us from abroad. A lot of time coming to us from Chile. And then there's this other aspect, which is this back and forthness that goes on with the salmon trade. A certain portion of the salmon that we catch here, often in Alaska, gets frozen at sea, sent to China, or Thailand, or Vietnam, defrosted, boned, filleted, refrozen, and sent back to us, double frozen. Huge portion of it. I was on Fresh Air, and I said that to Terry Gross, and she was like, my mother always told me not to double freeze meat. And I was like, well, I agree with your mother, Terry. And meanwhile, and what's kind of strange is that if you Google double frozen, the next thing that'll show up in your Google search a lot of times is triple frozen, and sometimes quadruple frozen. So that there is this tremendous fish laundering operation that's going on in Asia with all kinds of fish going in and who knows what going out, which brings us to our fourth most consumed fish in America. So this is the Alaska pollock. Okay, so at least we can say that this fish is an American fish. A couple billion pounds of it caught every year, but meanwhile we're sending about 600 million pounds of it abroad. Some of it comes back to us, some of it gets made into these products here. Alaska pollock is both the fish in the Filet-O-Fish sandwich. It's also the crab in the fake crab in the California roll. Those of you who are fans of Curb Your Enthusiasm might remember that Larry David ends up breaking up with his wife because she complains that during word sex, he can't stop talking about the difference between fake crab and real crab. So that's the fake crab. It's in the Alaska pollock. And one of my Twitter followers said, I wonder how it would sell. Instead of calling it fake crab, they called it real pollock. Good question. Anyway, that's the fourth most consumed fish in America. It's a very good fish. We should be eating more of it, but instead we do send quite a bit of it abroad, and in return, we get fish like this. So this is tilapia, right? So to me, this is the ultimate expression of how screwed up our seafood economy is. There in the corner, you see the Garton's fisherman in his slicker, and he's steering his boat over the Georges bank, and he's going to bring you back some tilapia. And for those of you who know tilapia is a tropical fish. It actually dies in water that goes below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. From an ecological point of view, as a farm fish, it's not too bad. It goes from egg to an adult in about 9 months. But it certainly is not a wild fish, and certainly, I think if the Gorton's fisherman saw it, he would step on it. Anyway, that's the fifth most consumed fish in America, mostly coming to us from China. And the sixth most consumed fish in America is this baby. So these are Pangasius catfish. Pangasius catfish grow very, very quickly as well. I've been to some of these Pangasius catfish farms. And I should say, you have all probably eaten Pangasius catfish, you just probably don't know it. If you've been in a large institution, chances are Pangasius catfish has crossed your plate. So like in a hospital, you're lying in bed and the orderly says, what would you like for dinner tonight? Would you like chicken or fish? And you're like, I don't know, what's the fish? I don't know, mister, it's just fish. That's what it is Pangasius catfish. So these fish go from egg to an adult very quickly as well. Some say even faster than tilapia. They grow very fast. You can cram them into the ponds like this, and they are really crammed in like cheek to jowl. And if they run out of oxygen, as they do, they raise their little faces above the surface of the water, and they take a breath of air. They are air breathing. So ladies and gentlemen, I give you the sixth most consumed seafood in America, the Pangasius catfish. So when I did all of this, and when I looked at all of this, I realized that I wanted to kind of figure out how we'd gotten ourselves into this particular mess. And to some degree, the book is the story of this mess and how we got into it, and some suggestions as to how we got out of it, although I've been doing this symposium series around the country in different fishing communities, and listening more than talking and kind of seeing that the way out is a very interesting way. There is a way out, but it's complicated. So anyway, but let's talk about how we got in. The first way I think we got in has to do with our coastal ecosystems, and it's very apt that we were discussing at the beginning the question of shellfish and shellfish viability. And I know that acidification is a huge issue out here. I visited with Taylor shellfish farms out here, and I've definitely seen that in the lab, some very serious problems. But before there was acidification, there was a tremendous oyster apocalypse that happened in the Northeast. So this is the eastern oyster, Cressostraea virginica, a different oyster than you guys grow out here typically. But once upon a time, in my native New York, as I mentioned at the beginning, oysters were a huge part of New York. Something like several trillion oysters lived in the waters around New York City. So many oysters that, with each oyster filtering about 50 gallons of water per oyster per day, it was said that the entire New York Bight turned over every few weeks after having been filtered by oysters. And this created a tremendous local economy. So this is my Manhattan Bridge that I mentioned near the Fulton Market. Those piles are piles of oyster shells. And these kinds of oyster houses lined all up and down the East River, all around Staten Island. There were tremendously viable and vigorous and different kinds of oysters in New York. Those of you, anybody here ever been to New York or lived in New York? So, oh wow, fishing and New York at the same time. You'd all be curious to know that once upon a time there was a kind of oyster in New York called a gowanus. Now, those of you who know the gowanus canal, it's a Superfund site today. But once upon a time, there was an oyster varietal called the gowanus. So, what happened? Well, and I should also say that oysters are tremendously good places for fish to live. They are one of the only shellfish out there that build in 3 dimensions. And so, as a result, they build kind of like fish condominiums. Some surveys of oyster restoration projects have found that when you have the presence of an oyster reef, you can have as many as twice as many fish inhabiting an area. So, what happened, though, is that at first we went on a wild oyster binge. And we've lost about 80% of our wild oyster reefs around the world, around the country, and also around the world, I should say. It's one of the most endangered ecosystems out there. We mined them out very vigorously, starting literally on the time of our arrival. When we first came to New York, oysters in New York Harbor were so big, I think it was Jonathan Swift said that eating an American oyster was like eating a baby. They were so big. And also it was noted that to properly eat a New York oyster, you had to cut it into 4 pieces. So they were really huge and big, but we immediately mined them out. We took the shells out of the water and burned them down for lime, used them for roadbed, got rid of them altogether. But nevertheless, we still had a very active oyster farming industry that took over after the wild beds failed in 1820. And we had tremendous wild beds, tremendous farmed operations. And at one point, Americans ate probably as many oysters per person per year as today we consume shrimp per person per year. But once again, we see this kind of massive decline. That big spike is around 1890 or so, 1900. What that spike marks is the confluence of understanding of bacteriology and oysters, where we started to understand that oysters were a vector for things like typhoid and things like hepatitis. And so once people started to realize that, they were like, ugh, I don't want the oysters. But it should be noted that we got to that place in the first place because we were putting about 600 million gallons of raw sewage into New York Harbor each and every day. So if you do that, eventually you're going to get that kind of problem with your oysters. Well, you see this peak in around the 1900s, and then it drops off. And I should say this is oyster throughout New England, from New York all the way to Boston. It's from a book called Oystering from New York to Boston. And you see it drop off. But once people stop eating from their local waters, the waters got worse and worse. It wasn't just biological contamination that marked the first part of oyster destruction. Then came all sorts of other horrible things. Phenols, heavy metals, Agent Orange was produced in New Jersey and dumped into the New York Bight. And you just see the production going down and down and down and down. But you notice at the very far end of that graph a little uptick. And if you look at that date, what that is around 1972. And what happens there is the Clean Water Act. And so what we're seeing, actually, after about 40 years of clean water action, the oyster industry is starting to revive. And we were at 1% of historical capacity. Now we're at 14% of historical capacity. And a big part of the book talks about the effort in New York City to try and restore oysters and all the ins and outs of it. And I will say that I did actually eat a New York City oyster, but I recommend that you don't try this at home. I always say I'm a professional writer, don't try it at home. Anyway, this is all just to show that there are some oysters starting to come back. This is in Soundview in the Bronx. This shows you what oysters really can do when they're left to their own devices. They build vertically. And this is a clump of nice vertical accretion that we like to see. And we also see them now starting to colonize these things in the Bronx. So they've been putting all sorts of oyster restoration structure into New York Harbor that scientists and PhDs have worked out. This is a radial tire, which the oysters found very, very amenable. And one of the scientists said to me when he saw that, geez, if Clean Water Act would just allow us to dump a bunch of tires into the New York Harbor, we'd have a lot of oysters. So anyway, and then, as I said earlier, the way that the parallel of the decline of oysters and the rise of shrimp is really striking. You just see oysters going down, 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 and you see the rise of imported shrimp. And that brings us to our next creature, which is the shrimp. So shrimp, as I mentioned, is the most consumed seafood in America. This is one of my seafood equations. Shrimp consumption equals roughly the next 2 most consumed combined, salmon and tuna. And we've also seen dramatic changes in our shrimp. So this shrimp is an interesting little creature. It's called Macrobrachium ohione. It's macrobrachium for the long arm, and ohione for the Ohio. Strange, you don't really associate shrimp with Ohio. But this shrimp hatches in the Delta, in the Mississippi Delta, and then swims all the way up to Ohio and back, to the Ohio River, I should say. Once upon a time, there were trillions and trillions of these shrimp in the river, and it was a very, very large commercial harvest, and it can be argued that this was the original shrimp of Cajun shrimp culture. This was what they ate, but we don't really eat this one anymore. Why? Mostly because of this. One of the recurring arguments in the book is this constant trading of seafood for land food. Given a choice, Americans always seem to choose the land food option. So what happened in our shrimp producing heartland was really agriculture. Corn and soy production really did huge damages to the Mississippi River and to the Mississippi Delta. To make way for more corn and soy farming and to do flood protection, things like this were carried out. This is the Greenville bins in a lower part of the Mississippi. You'll see that what they did after the 1927 flood is literally cut off oxbows to make the river straighter, to make it more containable. And actually what it did is it made it faster. I think it went from something like an average rate of 4 miles per hour to something like 7 or 8 miles per hour, so that those little shrimp couldn't complete their migration. But it wasn't just those little shrimp that were affected by it. All sorts of other things were affected, where you had nutrients just spilling out into the Gulf of Mexico faster and faster, coming in, because you keep in mind, the Mississippi drains all of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. That whole territory is this vast, vast draining grounds for the Mississippi. So that has really changed the chemical composition of the delta. Other thing, of course, is oil development. These are all oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico. You know, and Louisiana and Mississippi and the Gulf Coast. And you always think, oh, well, they stopped that Deepwater Horizon thing, that just stopped that. Well, these are all the active wells that you have along there. And it also did this to the delta. So this is the Mississippi Delta, and I should note that the delta is extremely important to shrimp production and for seafood production in the Gulf in general. Something like 70% of northern Gulf seafood require the salt marsh of the delta to survive for at least some part of their existence. We're presently losing the Mississippi Delta at a rate of about a football field an hour. A football field an hour. So this is a recently inundated stretch that was in the New York Times. And you can see these straight channels that are cutting through that delta. And what those were shipping channels for the oil industry, basically, allowing them a faster passage from the rigs to the refineries on shore. Also, there's a huge spider web of pipelines underneath this. This allows salt water to get into brackish areas, causes marsh grass to die, causes it to grade and fall apart, and boom, you have this kind of land loss. This is land loss in Louisiana at this point. So a very, very severe thing. Well, you would think, geez, people would be like, we're losing our shrimp. We got to stop this. You know, what this madness? Please stop it. We've got to save the shrimp. Well, it doesn't really happen that way because we have some other things going on with shrimp that mask that signal. There's a lot of noise masking the signal of dying seafood in America. And the largest sort of noise that masked that was the rise of farmed shrimp. So these two guys are the founders of farmed shrimp. Dr. Fujinaga and Dr. Lau. Dr. Fujinaga started working on shrimp in Japan in the 30s and 40s. He was a great internationalist. He really believed in multicultural cooperation, so he sort of did the heresy of bringing in graduate students from around the world in post-war, even pre-war Japan, and he actually published his dissertation about shrimp domestication in English, which was also very heretical at the time. So Dr. Fujinaga started on shrimp domestication with a shrimp called the kuruma prawn. And this kuruma prawn was a creature that was used in a dish called dancing shrimp. And dancing shrimp, what you do is you take a live shrimp out of a little bucket next to you, you rip off its carapace, you dip it in sake, and then you pop it in your mouth while it's still alive, dancing shrimp. So obviously, if you want to have live shrimp at your table, you're going to need some way of getting them there. And that's kind of was his motivation for getting shrimp aquaculture off the ground. And he did. He managed to tame the kuruma prawn and patent a lot of his technology. And then subsequent people like Dr. Lau went on to try it with other shrimp. Like, remember the tiger prawn? Remember when the tiger prawn suddenly became popular? That's a lot of result of Dr. Lau's work. Well, all's well and good. Shrimp do have many ecological advantages from an aquaculture standpoint. You can get 2, sometimes 3 crops of shrimp a year in tropical environments because the water is warm. Remember, we're talking about cold-blooded organisms. They're able to grow much faster in these hot conditions. But there are also other collateral damages that occur, not unlike some of the damages that are occurring in our own shrimp heartland. So this is a mangrove forest. This is a photo I took a few years ago in southern Vietnam near the province of Cà Mau, these are mangrove forests. And mangrove forests are as critical to Southeast Asian and tropical seafood as salt marsh is to our seafood in the Gulf. Mangrove forests stabilize land. You can see the root structure that holds in very, very important alluvial soils and estuarine soils. They are tremendous breeding grounds for all the wild seafood. But after decades and decades of shrimp aquaculture in Southeast Asia, these kind of environments look more like this. These are Asian shrimp ponds, stripped of their mangroves, stripped of their natural vegetation, stripped of their natural storm protection. And I should say it's a really big issue. And so when we had that big typhoon in the Philippines last year, a lot of country was inundated precisely because there weren't the mangrove forests to protect them. Just as New York in Hurricane Sandy was really severely hit because the oyster reefs weren't there to guard the shoreline anymore. So very, very serious changes to the environment. And it's further complicated by the fact that this is a shrimp with a disease called white spot disease. White spot disease is one of many infections that spreads through shrimp farms. Shrimp are very primitive, so they don't have very much in the way of an immune system. There's been all these weird diseases like yellowhead, white spot, vibrio. And last year, there was a disease that started in China in 2007, spread throughout Southeast Asia, called early mortality syndrome. Whenever I'm lecturing to an older crowd, I'm careful to say that it's not going to apply to you. That really has to do more with shrimp and their early mortality. So an early mortality syndrome is a bacterial infection spread from farm to farm, spread from country to country. And in, last year, Thailand, in addition to having this whole slavery scandal around the shrimp industry, lost $1 billion in shrimp crop. So the shrimp situation is by no means stable, and it's by no means should it be stable. I would strongly argue that this state we're in, where 4 pounds of our 15 pounds of seafood consumed in this country per person per year shouldn't be shrimp, that we need to expand our taste and really think about other things. But we didn't exactly. Instead, what we did is, these are the industrial seafood children of the 60s. The opening of the door of shrimp aquaculture opened the door to this kind of industrialization overall of seafood. And that's when you start to see things like the filet-o-fish sandwich, like the Red Lobster chain, like Long John Silver's, where more and more product was made and sculpted into these kind of non-fishy forms. And it was paralleled by the rise in imports. And so you see shrimp just dominating there. This is from about 1975 to the present. You see shrimp just booming, tuna booming, salmon booming, tilapia booming, and pangasius going up. And pollock is an import too, because we also import that as well as from Russia, while we're sending 600 million pounds abroad. So it's very, very strange. So that's kind of the scene that we set when we opened the door to shrimp aquaculture. The last fish on my list, and when I have students in the audience, I'm always reminded of, like, whenever somebody lectured to me that today I'm going to talk about 3 things, and then you get to the third one, you're like, oh, it's finally getting to the end. So yes, this is the third fish, and it's particularly relevant for you guys here in the Pacific Northwest, in the Salmon Nation. I don't need to show you this slide. You all know your salmon. But it's important to note that once upon a time, we in the East Coast also had viable commercial runs of salmon. Fishing nations post-World War II started doing prospecting more and more for undiscovered stocks of fish. And so they isolated and found these 2 large aggregations of salmon in the North Atlantic, and they fished them, and they fished them extremely hard. So you saw salmon production just plunge after World War II. But the other thing going on was this. So this is my home state of Connecticut. And you might be wondering, why does Connecticut have the measles? I know contagion is on everybody's mind right now. But it doesn't have the measles. Every dot on that map is a dam. The state of Connecticut has 3,000 dams in it alone. I always thought that was kind of shocking. I mean, and I often say that this is, I'm from Connecticut, so I can say this is why people in Connecticut are so uptight. If their chi is blocked. If somebody could just unblock Connecticut's chi, it would be a much happier. It's a very influential state. And I remember I made this joke at a conference of national parks folks, North Carolina, and this gentleman sidled up to me afterwards. He says, you ought to not be so hard on Connecticut. And I was like, why is that? He says, well, we in North Carolina, we got 35,000 dams. So it's just crazy the amount of dams that we have. Over 75,000 technically dams, but several million obstructions that also block the passageway, not just for salmon, but river herring, shad, sturgeon, all these great things that once were part of the dining profile of this country. So, and as you know, and as I know, in Oregon, you're dealing with a lot of some of these same issues when your dams are much more recent. Well, of course, not everybody has gotten into the dam building spree, and that's what brings me up to this last great seafood fight that I profiled in the book, which is Bristol Bay, Alaska. Who here has been to Alaska? Oh my God, wow, this is a very extremely impressive crowd. So, I mean, you all know that when you go to Alaska, it's like getting your socks knocked off in terms of, wow, this is what the Salmon Nation is supposed to look like. This is what salmon country looks like. Look at all this. This is Bristol Bay. To your right, you see Lake Iliamna, which if it were down south would be a Great Lake. but up there it's just a lake. You know, and I joke that Minnesota, you know, boasts about being the land of 10,000 lakes. And I think, you know, Alaska is like 3 million lakes. So it's just like orders of magnitude. But, you know, this is this incredible salmon country that is really, really amazing, really productive. And it's, in a way, when you fly over salmon country like this, you kind of have the same feeling as when you fly over Iowa and all that corn. Wow, you need a lot of country to grow a lot of food. Duh. Very, very, you know, obvious when you see it in front of your face. And I would say that this salmon country is so amazing that it inspires really, truly bizarre fishing. You know, and from a fishing point of view, I was really glad to experience. So this is a fly that they use in Alaska. It's called a flesh fly. It's used because salmon so power the ecosystem in Alaska that there are so many salmon in Bristol Bay that the people, when they come to go sport fishing, they don't even really want to go fishing for salmon. They want to go for rainbow trout. You know, it's like perverse fishing guy stuff. So in order to fish for rainbow trout in Alaska, what you use is a flesh fly oftentimes. And a flesh fly imitates rotting salmon flesh. There's so much salmon in the water that this is what they want to eat. And here's an example of one I just caught right off the dock casting with the flesh fly. And this fish fought really hard against like 10-knot current when I brought it in. It was still, you know, extremely alive when they brought it in. It was so alive that it slipped out of the guy's hands. And it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going. So it was just like really incredible. I mean, this was like this incredibly powerful fish, and when he finally did manage to get a hold of it and release it, it like trembled for a second and then took off like an ingot of silver up that 10-knot current. So powerful, so energetic, because as we all know, those of us who are students of salmon know, is that all these ecosystems would be very poor were it not for salmon. That it was salmon that bring the nutrients in from the Bering Sea, in from the ocean, and fertilize and allow us to have great forests, allow us to have really these amazingly productive ecosystems. Well, and they also allow us to have amazing fisheries. So, you know, this is near the Kvichak, the mouth of the Kvichak River, and just an amazingly abundant fishery with very, very diverse fisheries, small scale, large scale, very, very diverse, very well managed. If you are caught fishing out of period, as some fishermen in the audience will know, the Alaska Fish and Game Department is more than happy to drop a helicopter on your mud flat and issue you a $4,000 ticket. It's very, very rigorously enforced, and so it allows you to have handsome men catching beautiful salmon under rainbows. But seriously, I mean, great. I really just love going to Alaska because, you know, people in Alaska actually know how to do things. Most people I meet in Alaska seem to have built their house. You know, it always amazes me the know-how that's there. And this is a really great collective. It's called the Iliamna Fish Company. They, in addition to selling the canneries, they also have their own labeled salmon that they sell directly to consumers in Portland and in Brooklyn. You know, go figure, those kind of places. But anyway, I mean, it's a really, really amazing place. But of course, this amazing, amazing fishery, this amazing salmon ground, which really, in my opinion, should be just salmon ground, this is what's planned for it. You know, those of you who has followed the Pebble Mine debate here, so pretty well versed. So, you know, something like a 10 billion ton strike has been found in this area, and there is a lot of talk these days about possibly trying to put in what would be the continent's largest copper and gold mine, pretty much right adjacent to the largest salmon run, or largest sockeye salmon run in the world. In addition to it being very, very close to the spawning grounds, and would straddle both the Kvichak and the Shigat drainages, so it would be very, very impactful on the Bristol Bay area. It would require the construction of a 2,000-foot deep retaining lake, and all of it would be held up by earthen dams, and it's in an earthquake zone. So it's kind of a dubious project, in my opinion. It's a very, very intense project, and there's been a really intense debate about it. What's been nice, and what's been sort of, you know, when I was writing this book, it was hard to kind of stay pace with affairs, because what you really have is a circle that's been drawn around the sockeye salmon off Bristol Bay, where you have for the first time sport fishermen and commercial fishermen really coming to the table and saying, no, we don't want this mine, we want this fishery. This fishery is worth $200 million a year at least, some say $500 million a year. Yeah, the mine is worth $300 to $500 billion, but if you advertise this out over a number of years, eventually the salmon are more valuable. Meanwhile, the EPA has said that if we were to build Pebble Mine, part of the agreement would have to be agreeing to monitor the site in perpetuity. So in other words, like 10,000 years from now, somebody from the government is going to say to some guy, hey, you know that big retaining lake full of toxic sludge, you're going to have to monitor that. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So I find this just bizarre, and I'm really glad to see that we are just starting to get what's called a 404C action started through the Clean Water Act that might prevent a dump and fill permit for the Pebble Partnership. We might just save this fishery. And to me, this really is an emblem of why it is important to keep our environments intact and at the same time keep our fishermen intact. Because if our fishermen are linked to our environment, they become its own greatest defenders. So if there's one political message for this, it's no pebble wine. So I thought I would leave you with a little just reading from the book, just to give you a taste of it. So I think we're doing assignment 1. Yeah. So there are many more words that you can read on your own, but but not for free. So I thought I would just read from this little bit here. This is again at the Iliamna Fish Company on the mouth of the Queejack River. But to me, this is sort of almost like a Renaissance picture of the working fisherman, really putting all his effort into this really amazing product. So I was up right near there at the end of my stay in Alaska, and I'll just read from there. Passing up to a bluff, I looked down on the isolated little settlement, washed by the foam of the Bering Sea, and thought that once upon a time, a little 17th century village called New Amsterdam must have looked quite a bit like this. A modest place with its face turned toward the sea, where the fisherman and the fishmonger were an integral part of daily life, and where seafood held its own land food in nearly every regard. What kind of alternative future might America have had if the descendants of New Amsterdam had decided that seafood, not land food, would be the country's bread and butter? Not a Jeffersonian society that relied upon the harvest of agriculture, not a Hamiltonian one that captained banking and industry, but rather a Neptunian democracy that lived off the sea, a place where estuaries were recognized as the heart of the food system, where rivers were rarely fettered for fear of impeding the miraculous runs of salmon, sturgeon, shad, and herring, where human development moved in parallel with the protection of the near shore. What kind of society might we have formed had we not, as Melville wrote in Moby Dick, become landsmen, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks? What if instead we had become what Melville called a society fixed in ocean rivers? So thank you very much.